Right. So thank you very much for coming today to this episode of the Palestine Interdisciplinary Dialogues. We have created the Palestine Interdisciplinary Dialogues as a network of researchers to normalize conversation on Palestine at a moment in which, especially at the beginning of our efforts, there was a strong desire to silence Palestinian voices and deplatform Palestinian voices. We have really started this, and we had so many of these events, and every time there is a great attendance. So thank you so much for coming today. I'm sure some people will join late. That's always what happens. We also have 33 people online, so thank you so much to all the people online for joining us online as well. The next of these events, I always remind people, so the next one of these events for this year is going to be on the 28th of November. We are going to have Emil Badarin, an academic who is going to present his new book, Recognition Politics in Settled Colonial States, Normalizing Dispersion and Elimination in Palestine. And let's always remind ourselves that Palestine is a settled colonial issue, and not a religious issue, not a sectarian issue. It's an issue of colonialism and invasion and occupation and taking over the land. So today we are incredibly lucky, and I actually mean it, to have Philip Proudfoot, simply because he's never in England. And also because he's a incredibly interesting guy to have. So Philip works at our neighbor institution, the Institute of Development Studies, who is #1 for development studies in the world.
Combined with Sussex. Combined with Sussex.
Combined with Sussex.
Yeah.
Combined with Sussex.
Yeah.
So let me just introduce Philip, who's gonna present a super interesting topic today. Gaza and the end of humanitarianism. Yeah, I told you that people were coming in late. Just gonna give a minute to the people in the room to settle in and start again. Right. So whoever come in, welcome to the Palestine Interdisciplinary Dialogues. As I said, this is one of many of our events. This is the last, the one before the last event in the year. Next event is 28th of November. So I was about to introduce our wonderful speaker, Philip Proudfoot, who is taking a really interesting take on giving us a very interesting take on humanitarianism. The word humanitarianism during this genocide has been abused, and humanitarianism has been used as a means of war rather than a means of sustainment of the people under occupation. And so, as Palestine is our zenith, is making us think very clear about what's happening in the world. And it's also doing that with humanitarianism. It's really clarifying how humanitarianism has been hashed for decades as an opportunity to enter and to manipulate territories and agendas. And in this case, this has been magnified by the situation in Palestine. And this is what Philip is going to speak about today. So Philip is Dr. Philip Proudfoot, is a political activist and humanitarian researcher at the Institute of Development Studies here at the University of Sussex. His work explores the politics of humanitarianism, displacement, and rising global impunity. He's currently writing a new book about the collapsing moral foundation of liberal humanitarianism. So I'm really eager to hear this, because this is effectively a little bit of your book coming through to us. He's also just come back from Sudan, working on the Sudanese response, working with the Norwegian Refugee Council. So thank you very much for being here at this very important time, Philip.
Thank you.
We're going to speak for 45, 50 minutes, and then we're going to do Q&A and really open it up to conversation.
So yeah, this is what I'm going to be presenting is really the introduction and first chapter of the book that I'm now writing with Polity, and I'm supposed to submit it in March. it's going okay. I might make that deadline. So, but this is also a great opportunity to present some of these ideas to start to refine and shape them. So if you disagree with things I say, please tell me that you disagree and why you disagree, because I like to make sure my arguments are sharp and convincing. So really, I'm going to try and answer two questions, which is, the first is, can humanitarianism, and don't worry, I'm going to define what I mean by these terms, but can humanitarianism survive Gaza? And if it at least can't in its current form, then rather than just, dwell in despair, I'm going to ask, what might humanitarianism look like if it were instead guided by more activist or anti-imperialist principles? So I am a very argumentative person, so I like to frame everything I do in life as an argument, which is not always a successful interpersonal skill, but it's how I approach everything. So I'm going to now tell you what is the argument that I'm making in the book, and I'm going to make in the talk. So my argument is that the humanitarian system, and the word system is important, the liberal post-World War II system, which emerged within and remains wedded to imperialism. This has both a material and ideological effect or implications for that system. So because it emerged and remains wedded to imperialism, this produces distinct material and ideological effects. However, I don't want to argue, which sometimes people do when they make this more direct critique of the aid system, I don't want to argue that this is totalizing, that there aren't spaces, even within the formal system, where we can identify moments of resistance or slippages or space within formal aid to, even within the formal system, imagine a different way of doing things. So, one of the advantages of working at IDS is that I do academic stuff like this, but I came back from South Sudan working with the Norwegian Refugee Council. I see how the aid system actually functions on a day-to-day level, and the ways in which even a system that might overarchingly appear imperialist or colonial, people can nonetheless find ways within it to do some good. But that doesn't mean that good saves it. So Gaza, I think, has revealed with intensity and ferocity the effects and implications of that global humanitarian system. And it now is risking discrediting the aid system at a global scale. However, humanitarianism is not the humanitarian system. Humanitarianism is the impulse, but not the post-World War II aid system. So this impulse, the humanitarian impulse, is neither Western nor colonial, but it is human. And here I draw inspiration from one of my former teachers, David Graeber, who's written about what he calls baseline communism, we could even see, or we could think about mutual aid or evolutionary advantages of cooperating and not wanting to see people suffer. There's a very essential human impulse at the heart of humanitarianism that the system, I think, attempts to distort. So to set humanitarianism free, we need a radically different vision of aid. And that means decolonizing aid or removing its imperialist dimensions, which means tackling something that is both material and ideological. And my proposition is that aid needs to connect back to publics rather than donors of the aid system, i.e. FCDO, USAID, such that it existed. We need to stop thinking so much about what will the donors say and more about what will the public say. And this is not something I also argue in the historical part of my new book. It's not necessarily something that's new, but actually we can find this in the very origins of most of the organizations, the big NGOs that we think of today. So Save the Children, Oxfam, these organizations have at their foundational point an activist attempt to engage a public to support their mission. And those skills have been lost by the aid system. So let me now do my definitions. So humanitarianism is the Now this definition, I should say, comes from Tamam Aludat and Khan, and Tamam Aludat is the editor of the editor of the New Humanitarian. So humanitarianism is the active belief in the equal value of all human life and the consequent action to assist others to protect their rights and accept and promote their agency and worldview. So this, I think, is a nice comprehensive definition of what the humanitarian impulse is. It's about valuing all lives equally and then acting to protect those lives and promote those rights and accept and promote their agency and worldview. It doesn't necessarily mean that we dismiss or try to change their worldview. Humanitarian aid, which I call instead of humanitarian system in my work, is, the current form, humanitarian aid, is the formalized system of governments, agencies, and organizations that are largely based in and led by the global north. So that, and I'll provide graphs and descriptions and illustrate it, but that's basically here, these two things, I've represented them by the Samud flotilla, which I think embodies humanitarianism, and then the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Tom Fletcher, who I think embodies humanitarian aid, although he probably disagrees, he's not even good, so. Okay, so the active belief in the equal value of all human life and the consequent action to assist others. Where do we see this? Well, we see this at the very foundation points of Western style humanitarianism. So I am predominantly talking about humanitarianism as it emerged in the global north. I'm not talking so much about other sorts of humanitarian-like traditions that exist in the global south. So humanitarianism began in its, or one of the stories of its origins, I should say, and these are kind of origin myths. So, you know, if you're familiar with the history, you can critique me, and I know that there are different origin stories. But if we say that it began with Henri Dunant and the Battle of Solferino. So Dunant was traveling to Italy for business. He was a businessman. He saw the scenes of a battle where there were people left to die in the fields in agony and pain. And then he was also really impressed when he was there, when he saw the local townspeople mobilizing together to bring food, assistance, and water to the injured, regardless of their particular affiliation within the battle. So they were assisting people on the basis of their needs and suffering. Then Dunant goes on to write essentially a pamphlet, which is called the Battle of Solferino, which was a campaigning piece of literature designed to provoke an emotional response in bureaucrats in Europe at the time. And then this ultimately then led to the foundation of the International Committee of the Red Cross. And then this moved into the codification of the rules of the humanitarian system and humanitarian law as we know now. So that moved into neutrality, impartiality, universality, the emergence of the Geneva Conventions. So even if we take the most orthodox organization in the humanitarian system, the Red Cross, Red Crescent, is seen as the guardians of traditional or orthodox humanitarianism. Nonetheless, we can find an initial act of activism and campaigning in its foundation. This attempt to promote and push the foundation of an organization and change people's views at the time around whether or not soldiers are supposed to just die in pain, or whether or not all people deserve some treatment and assistance. Then if we go to Britain, what's really interesting in the history of Save the Children is that Save the Children was founded by two individuals, one called Eglantine Jebb and her sister, Dorothy Buxton. Dorothy Buxton was a socialist. She was part of the kind of Bloomsbury crowd of socialists in Victorian Britain, and she was a radical campaigner, and Eglantine Jebb, her sister, who was liberal, lesbian, but more conservative. And it's always interesting when you look at Save the Children as to which of the two figures they decide is their founder. So for a long time, Jebb was the founder. They talk a bit more now about Buxton. But they founded Save the Children to respond to the end of the First World War, when the Allied powers were blockading Germany. And their first action, they met in Buxton's living room, and their first action was to send baby bottle tops to German mothers so they could feed their children. And when they did that, they were fighting against the prevailing attitude of the time, which is that these are the children of enemies. Why should we assist these people? They did it as a deliberately political act. And by all accounts of that time, the aid that they sent was symbolic, relatively inefficient, but it nonetheless broke the siege. That might sound a bit familiar. So they, nonetheless, we can see that in the foundations of Save the Children was an attempt to break a siege. But we also should be clear that this idea of humanitarianism has no monopoly in Geneva or in New York. Instead, we can see these exact same impulses to assist and protect the rights of others along various different political lines. So in earlier work, I've argued that there's a third tradition of humanitarianism. So you have the Orthodox, the Red Cross, you have New, which is like MSF, which is a kind of liberal humanitarianism where you witness and call to account. But I previously also in other work argued that there is a left-wing humanitarian tradition that we can see through figures like Kropotkin, mutual aid, squatting practices, no borders activism, where sometimes it's called prefigurative politics, where you act in the world in a way in which you want the world to be. And one of those ways we want the world to be is that people don't just suffer because of particular crises that they're exposed to. So I've done work in Exarchia, in Greece, where a lot of the anarchists there were housing refugees in squats, and they were doing so on the basis not of international humanitarian law, but because they believe in sort of a prefigurative political tradition where they want to assist people in this world now as their form of politics. But we also see this kind of practice, this mutual aid, assisting people on the basis of their needs in periods of hardship, even during things like the miners' strike, where you have like collective cooking, addressing the rising food insecurity among miners who are on strike. So we actually see these impulses everywhere, and we shouldn't necessarily try and differentiate between social movements that are more grounded in direct action versus those that are more based in supporting each other. Actually, they work together. We also see it in religious traditions. So while none of these perfectly overlap onto that definition, nonetheless, we see hints of this idea in zakat, charity, alms, dana. We see this idea of provision for people in a time of need everywhere. And then, I'm trained as an anthropologist, so if we go back to pre-industrial society, then we see many examples of various different forms of assistance that pre-industrial societies engage in that try to raise the dignity of others and reduce any potential suffering or harm, from gift economies to traditions of enforced reciprocity. A good example of this I always give to students is that if you're not from England, but you're basically from any other country, and you try and eat in front of someone and they don't have food, you feel a sense of moral revulsion, such that you feel you have to offer them the food. You're like, please take, please take. You can't just eat in front of them. And this is what's called enforced reciprocity. So there are these cultural mechanisms that are actually really deep in what it means to be human around sharing, looking after each other, promoting agency, protecting rights. And this is a kind of, I'm thinking about calling this chapter from each according to his ability to each according to his humanitarian need. Because you can actually make these arguments and thread them all together to show that this is the kind of impulse that the humanitarian system claims to be engaged in. But then what about the current global North system? I took this picture in South Sudan last week. I like it because the wheels have come off. So what is the post-World War II humanitarian system? So this is the liberal system that arose alongside the UN that seeks to embed humanitarian action within a framework of laws, rights, and collective security. So this is the stuff we see on TV where Tom Fletcher is speaking to the Security Council, asking them to please tell the Israelis to respect international humanitarian law. It's when you have coordination meetings in country where different parts of the humanitarian system are responsible for different bits of needs in a crisis. So you'll have things like the water and sanitation cluster, you'll have the protection cluster, you'll have collective meetings around access, And it's all this attempt to build this system that's trying to address people's needs in a big, vast, complicated web of finances, which I'll show you. And the 1990s arguably marked the high point of this period, when you have this kind of liberal interventionism, and humanitarianism is seen part of this global project of democracy and market reform. And you know, suddenly you start to get all this consensus around supporting humanitarian aid. It's when in Britain the Department for International Development was founded, and Britain starts increasing its role in the world, and they openly see it as a form of soft power. They talk about it in terms of security. They all want to be part of this system, and it kind of gains a level of acceptance. We kind of accept this idea, and of course we are not there now anymore. We've gone from 0.7 to 0.3% of our contribution to humanitarian aid. So then institutionally, it consolidated around things like UNs, NGO. Then you get things like professionalized standards. So in a refugee camp, there were these attempts to develop essentially an accountancy system to say, you know, if you are a refugee, you have the right to a shelter of this size, and it must have this sort of cooking facility, and it must have this quality bedding. And there was an attempt to really formalize this entire thing into a big system. And even within these things, and I'll get to it more, but even with these things, we see good intentions. So even within this project of setting global minimum standards for humanitarian response, there are good intentions, because this emerged out of Rwanda, where it was a very chaotic humanitarian operation, where there was many overlapping forms of assistance and very low quality aid. So then people thought, let's build a global standard where everyone can say to they even wanted a humanitarian ombudsman, where refugees could then complain to the ombudsman about the lack of quality of provision that they'd been given. But all of this required on faith, or on sort of accepting something that's true that isn't true, a kind of cognitive dissonance, on international norms like neutrality, human rights, and a rules-based order. All of that requires that we accept that there is this system that exists, that if that refugee is not getting the sort of shelter that fits minimum standards, someone's then going to do something about it. Or if someone is denied access to the UN in a humanitarian crisis, then there's a mechanism in place to force that belligerent to allow the entrance of the UN. This all ultimately was based on a lie. So what do humanitarian operations look like? So these are two attempts to map them, and I'm sorry if there's anyone in the room who works in aid, but I have all of this in just to introduce it fully for those who aren't fully aware. So there are many, many competing organizations involved in any humanitarian operation, ranging from local NGOs, international organizations, UN agencies, donors, national governments, national military, and private sector. They're all part of this thing called the humanitarian operation. So in somewhere like Sudan, you have various meetings and coordination groups where all of these different people sit, and then they try and determine who is going to be responsible for water and sanitation in this camp. Who's going to be responsible for protection over there? And they basically fight it out over funding. And then I'll show the funding stuff in a second. You can then see this more complicated map. I'm sure you can't see it at the back. But this then, instead of putting operation, puts who really should be at the center, which is people affected by crisis. And then all of the different actors involved. This expands it also to local churches, to corporate donors, host government, regional organizations, international military forces, peacekeepers. So all these various complicated individuals are involved in a humanitarian response. So what about the money? Well, this is where we begin to see the real kind of imperialism at the heart of the system. So we can follow these. This is actually from the high point of humanitarian funding. It would probably look a lot smaller now, but at the high point, I think this is from 2020. We can follow this money. So this is money into the UN, multilateral organization, 16 million, and then we can follow where it goes. So here it goes down to unknown. Unknown. Basically, this means directly implemented projects, so the UN agency doing something themselves. There's also Saudi bills. This is paying for the UN staff. So the vast majority of that money is going down here. The amount of money going to local and national actors is here, tiny. And these are self-reported, and these are the ones that could be independently verified. So we can say this might be true, but this is definitely true, independently verified. So we can see a tiny, tiny amount of money was going to local humanitarian organizations. A little bit more was going to international actors. So that's multilateral organizations then giving their money to international organizations who then go on and maybe do something else, right? You know, international NGOs, again, largely unknown, a little bit to local, ICRC, a little bit to local, also unknown. So you can see that the vast majority of the money is going to maintaining the system. That's the point. Maybe some project, some direct project information, but a huge amount of money is going to maintaining that system. And then how does it talk about itself? Well, the humanitarian system has 4 values, which are neutrality, humanity, independence, and impartiality. So neutrality means that humanitarian actors do not take sides in hostilities. They are not guided by political, racial, religious, or ideological considerations. Now, obviously, with Gaza, and we'll get to it, this has begun to change substantially, given that the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is directly party to conflict. But it's also not necessarily the case if we take a step back and we say that the main donors for funding the humanitarian system are global north powers. Often they're also somehow taking part in hostilities. Now we can talk about Gaza, but we could also talk about UK funding for the Saudi Arabia during the war in Yemen. So, okay, fine, maybe we were funding some activities in Yemen, but we were also clearly not a neutral actor. So the donors are not a neutral actor, maybe the humanitarians are. Humanitarian suffering, this is humanity. Humanitarian suffering is addressed wherever it is found. It protects life, dignity, and health by ensuring the respect for human beings. Now, this is the kind of high-level ideal that in a world in which we have limited funding, that funding should be then directed to where humanitarian suffering is at its most profound and deepest. In 2020, I believe, the coordinated humanitarian appeal for Sudan was funded at 18%. The humanitarian appeal for Ukraine was funded at 80%. So the idea that humanitarian suffering is being addressed wherever it is found is for the birds. The reality is that funding flows are aligned to geopolitical considerations. Everyone knows this, and we should start being honest about it. This is the reality of whose crisis counts, which ones are forgotten, which ones get funded. Independence, humanitarianism should be autonomous from political, economic, military, or other objectives held by any other actors, not subordinated to the objective of fighting parties. And again, in a huge array of cases, we see that the UN is not perceived to be an independent body, but is perceived to be part of ongoing sort of objectives, even various NGOs, church groups. The idea of independence, no matter where you look at it, also starts to run into particular problems. Another problem I'll talk about in a bit is that if we're saying that humanitarian aid should be independent from economic objectives, then why in certain situations do humanitarians think the right thing to do is to give microloans to individuals to start small businesses? Well, because they have a particular vision of what economy should look like, which is broadly neoliberal and capitalist. So it's not independent from political, economic, and military objectives. And impartial. So it should be guided on the basis of need alone. Gives priority to most urgent cases without making distinction based on nationality, race, religion, or political opinion. And again, there we can return to the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which we will, where we see that assistance was being given on the provision on the basis of political opinion. That if you were perceived to have been engaged somehow in various activities, you would not be allowed to receive that assistance. So we see that these values are very weak, very plastic, and they're falling apart. The only defense that has ever been made of these values is that they are useful for negotiating humanitarian access, and that they're an objective that you claim you have in order to try and convince a belligerent to let you in, right? So if you're a belligerent and you say, but we're just here to assist people, we're not taking part in the conflict, then maybe they'll let you in. And this is sometimes used, and this is sometimes effective. But again, foreshadowing Gaza, but we can see that this is not effective anymore. So where is the imperialism in all of this? So by imperialism, we mean the practice or policy through which a state seeks to extend its power or influence, political, economic, military, or cultural, beyond its own borders to dominate or exploit other people and territories. Colonialism is a specific form of imperialism in which the state establishes itself in foreign lands, by settling its own population there, extracting resources, and subordinating local population. So I think that within aid, we can see two forms of imperialism and colonialism. So beyond land and resources, both imperialism and colonialism seek to transform the subjectivities of those who it seeks to dominate through language, education, and religion, producing compliant subjects and erasing indigenous ways of knowing and being. So I'm going to go through each of those ideas, economic imperialism, cultural imperialism, and political imperialism, and explain why the aid system reflects those 3 points and why that caused the problem it did in Gaza. So economic imperialism, extracting resources, start with that one. So donors predominantly remain tied to the global north. So largely funding is now aligned to global north priorities, conditionality, and various forms of contracting. So donors in the global north still control the vast amount of funds into the humanitarian system. They're not the only actors there. There are other actors involved, but often they're doing it outside the system. Aid allows for the kind of attempt to create, this is a soft power argument. So you're giving aid, and then that allows maybe the state who's providing that aid to secure a favorable agreement down the line, a favorable trade agreement. They're seen as being good people, they're assisted in a time of need, they get through the door. So that's in the interests of donors. Why would they give aid? Well, they want to secure the possibility for maybe extracting some resources or setting up a company. So it's used very much as a defended as, when people talk about soft power, that's really what they mean, right? Also, it's an attempt to contain labour, to contain refugees and keep labour cheap and block its mobility into the north. And we saw that very explicitly with things like the Jordan Compact in Turkey, where the deal was, Turkey stops Syrian refugees coming to Europe, and in exchange for that, they get money from the European Union. So also we then see a kind of commodification of survival. So this is where we see things like, and it's often treated as a kind of common sense. So when we talk about things like, humanitarians love to say that we're going to increase the resilience of communities living through crises. What they mean by that is essentially turning them into sort of neoliberal subjects. And that's fine, that's their vision of the world. But you can't then turn around and argue that actually this is a kind of neutral way of being, right? If you're saying the way you survive this crisis is you get a microloan and you start a small business, and often these are very unsuccessful programs, I should say, but if you say that's what your intention is, that's not neutral, that's a very particular vision of what it means to have an economy, society, or an individual. So all the way through there, we see particular forms of economic manipulation, attempts to use aid as a tool to expand markets, to contain refugees, to produce neoliberal subjects, and to tie funding to global north priorities. Aid also ultimately functions as a form of political colonialism, where it undermines sovereignty. So humanitarian access can sometimes be negotiated above, beyond, or besides, or without including governments in particular territories. So sometimes, humanitarians will work in countries where the government is not Israel, right? The government is problematic, but it's still the government, and they will ignore it entirely or undermine it or work outside of it. Now, this produces all sorts of problems because essentially they're producing their own kind of sovereignty, their own ability to work outside the sovereignty of the particular territory they're in. So it's state making by outsiders. And it's shaping all sorts of aspects. So they're essentially shaping things like the security, institutions, constitution. Often, I'll ask aid workers in countries that are in a protracted crisis to tell me what the health system looked like before the crisis. And they won't know the answer to that question. Yet nonetheless, they're running the health system in that country. and they have no vision or idea of what their health system should look like. So aid is used to then, again, keep refugees in the global south and also stabilize frontiers. So there's a kind of containment aspect of humanitarianism. So in many countries around the world today in humanitarian crisis, they're actually in what we call a protracted crisis, where the front line fighting has died down, but instead the aid system is keeping them on a humanitarian funding track. Why? Because development funding means you can build a water tower. Humanitarian funding means you can move water by truck, right? Not always, not exclusively, there are many exceptions, but you have to kind of do a kind of language game where you hide development within humanitarianism. So there's a desire to keep countries that have really relatively stabilized now in this perception of a humanitarian emergency. So I've seen senior figures in UN agencies at high-level events in countries that are not in a humanitarian emergency, speaking to donors as if that country is in a humanitarian emergency, which means for that agency that they get to then run that program, when it should actually be the responsibility of the state. And this is how aid functions as a de-development machine. So there's also selective universality. Like I said, some crises are considered more politically important than others. And then you have governance by projects. So you have these fragmented interventions that are substituting for long-time solutions. So again, like I said, hiding development in humanitarianism. You maybe might get an exception where they say you can build a water tower here, but you have to keep trucking water there. And there's no attempt to then build up a collective national water system, right? You just have this completely broken and fragmented and project-orientated way of responding to crises. So we also see that aid itself has a kind of cultural imperialism, where northern experts are seen to define what counts as evidence, what counts as best practice, and what counts as success. So they often position themselves as what's it?
What have I done? Well done. Some people can read the lentils.
Okay, so humanitarians can present themselves as these kind of, oh, is it come on again? How do they stop that? Present themselves as on a civilizing mission, that they are the bearers of superior knowledge and morality. So, for instance, in South Sudan, I was told, not everyone can come today because it's World Hand Washing Day. so the world comes around earlier every year. So there's a position of superior knowledge, morality, casting affected populations as passive recipients who need to be saved, uplifted, taught how to wash themselves properly, and all these kinds of things. And then also there's a way in which people become construed as victims or resilient or recipients, but not as political agents in their own rights. So we can look at the transformation of there's a brilliant book, Heroes and Martyrs, Palestine by Laila Khalili, where she shows how the transformation in Palestinian commemorations of martyrdom moved from heroic representations of people who died fighting the colonial regime to poor individual victims who had their rights deprived. And that's feeding into the idea of the worthy victim, the worthy subject, the subject worthy of humanitarian assistance, not a subject who has a right to political agency to fight and to resist, but whose only right is to suffer in exchange for support. Then we see the way in which a language of neutrality then depoliticizes suffering, obscuring the root causes of violence and inequality. So when we are saying that we are just responding to humanitarian need and all we see is the need, we ignore entirely, of course, what causes that need, and we don't even address that need. We say that's for development. But now, and for at least the past 15 to 20 years, development has never come to these countries. They have remained stuck in humanitarian development. And I put this because I think it's a great example. It's from Adam Curtis's Bitter Lake, where this is the charity that Rory Stewart used to work for, who has a career in humanitarianism. And this was a lecture about French abstract art to Afghani women to like civilize and culturally rescue them from the barbaric practices. This was Turquoise Mountain that did that. So where are we now today? Where does this leave us with Gaza? So where we are today is that humanitarianism one that seeks to reduce suffering due to the universal value of human life, is still alive. We can find it in places. But we also see a political economy of how humanitarians are influenced by the allocation of power and resources. So we can also see that the way in which some crises are more important than others is influenced by a broader global political economy. We also, I think I've made the case that humanitarians are always already doing politics. So the idea that they're not doing politics should be dismissed. They're doing organizational politics. So that's when they decide which organization gets the money, predominantly big international organizations and local organizations. They're doing distributional, distributional politics, so they're deciding where do those resources go, even in that country. So they're always doing a kind of politics. Yet the system continues to insist it's guided by humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. But long and short-term forces that I'm going to get to are stripping these words and this idea of humanitarian action from the final vestiges of meaning, and it's threatening the entire mission. So on the one hand, you have what I've talked about, these crises that are stuck in a perpetual state of crisis, of which Gaza was one, but it was a particular one. And then short-term emergencies where we're seeing an increasing explosion of impunity, hypocrisy, and an ability to get away with all sorts of crimes that are also threatening the entire system. So once, when I first started talking about Gaza, I tried to list, this was very early on, every point of international humanitarian law, every standard part of humanitarian operation and moral authority of the system that came to my mind without having to research it, where I was guessing from what I'd been reading, things were being violated. So this was early on. So early on, we saw immediate deliberate destruction of objects indispensable to survival. So that's deliberately targeting things like water towers, water production facilities, hospitals, food production facilities. We saw clear evidence of the desire to enact collective punishment. We saw almost immediate forced displacement, then forced displacement again, then redisplacement, more forced displacement. And then pretty quickly, we saw deliberate targeting of UN and civilian infrastructure. Of course, Israel has a history of deliberately targeting the UN, but they continued that history. Then on an operation front, we saw the use and abuse of humanitarian operations and humanitarian language, which was further discrediting humanitarianism. So we saw there's something called deconfliction in humanitarianism. So when you're engaging in a hot war, normally you coordinate with the belligerents and you tell them your coordinates, the number on the roof of your vehicle, where you're going, when you'll be back, the route you'll take. And then they radio back and acknowledge that you've said you're doing this mission, and then the assumption is they're not going to kill you, right? So when I was in Yemen, this is the only way you move around. You have to radio the Saudis. Saudis would confirm they're not going to kill you, and then you do the mission. Israel decided to use those attempts at deconfliction as targeting coordinates, which is early on. There were organizations that were then sending their coordinates not just to Kogat, the Israeli body responsible for overseeing the strip, but they were sending them to the US to try to get the US to ensure that the Israelis won't use the coordinates. So that disappeared. This standard operating practice was no longer effective. World Central Kitchen were killed on a deconflicted route. Needs assessments are a standard part of a humanitarian operation. So a crisis, a war, a natural disaster is an information-poor environment where we don't know what people need. So the humanitarian system has developed technical methods for going out, assessing what people need so they can ensure that the right things go to the right people at the right time. Israel's blocked anything like that since the beginning of the war. People are not going out and able to assess the humanitarian needs on the ground. So they just don't know. So even if they were operating, even if there was a standard humanitarian operation, it would still be quite chaotic because we don't know what people's actual needs are. Maybe here it's not food, here it's more water, but then they end up with food. Maybe here they need some basic painkillers, but they end up getting I don't know, sanitary kits. All the standard operational stuff disappeared. The aid distribution itself, especially under GHF, which I'm going to talk to you in a bit, so I'm not talking about that now. And then we saw repeated attempts to block access, PNG, which means persona non grata, PNGing UN staff, and then we saw, of course, more UN workers killed in any other conflict in the history of the organisation. Then we saw the abuse of the language. Humanitarian pause doesn't exist. No such thing called humanitarian pause. And then we saw it repeated by Western politicians. We need humanitarian pause. And then we saw donor political alignments directly influencing whether or not they were willing to stand up against these violations. I highly recommend Peter Orban's new book, Complicit, about Britain's role. I've just started it, but it's dreadful reading to see it all laid out, just how complicit we were as a key donor to the aid system, and all of the opportunities we had to act more strongly. But then we saw the campaign. So at this time I wrote a campaign against UNRWA. Actually, it was ultimately the defunding of UNRWA. And then we saw the veto power in the Security Council of these single objectives to secure peace and security in the world, repeatedly used to permit the continuation of genocide. So then the values end up looking like this. Humanity looks racialized, neutrality looks like complicity, impartiality looks like a biased response, and independence looks entirely controlled. But I thought I should probably update this. So now I've tried again to list every single violation of humanitarian law and operations in Gaza that I could think of. And I've done a bit more research, so I put them next to the particular legal statute that they violate. So I'm not going to go through them. But here's the first. Here's the second. And here's the third. Now these are the ones that are 100% would stand up in court in my view, where there's very, very, very clear evidence, clear aspects of international law, clear articles governing their behaviour that they haven't followed, that it's an overwhelming charge sheet for Israel. And what effect is this then having on humanitarian aid? So I think we have to see the genocide in Gaza alongside the rise more broadly of illiberalism, where we see these illiberal forces pushing down on the liberal humanitarian order, which is not capable of defending itself, leading to two possible splinterings, one hopeful and one less hopeful. So the liberal humanitarian order is splintering into a securitized humanitarianism, which is Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, Palantir, Fogbo, private military contractors, who are increasingly playing a role in humanitarian aid. And then we have on the other side, good guys in the narrative, vernacular humanitarianism, activist humanitarianism, grassroots humanitarianism, people who are providing aid on the basis of their more radical politics. And they've all of these things have always already existed. So I'm not arguing that this is a entirely new phenomena, but the collapse of the humanitarian system is pushing these two particular tendencies into the front. And we already, so I put co-option next to securitized humanitarianism, because we already see attempts by those secret meetings between various UN agencies and the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. So they were looking to co-opt and become part of and work with these securitized options. We also see an attempt at integrating and co-opting vernacular humanitarians. So in Sudan, the emergency rooms there, which were a candidate to win the Nobel Prize, where was mutual aid organizations providing humanitarian assistance that emerged out of the political opposition there. So they were politically aligned with various of aid. But we see that everywhere. In Syria, we have the local coordination committees. In Britain, even during COVID, there were mutual aid groups, and we saw how there was attempts even then to say, well, maybe these guys could actually start filling in for the NHS. Sign up on the NHS's webpage and you can do deliveries for the NHS. So we see these ways of these also integrated. So a liberal humanitarianism, which I think is emerging as a potential threat to the humanitarian liberal order, is an instrumentalization to enforce authoritarian regimes' control and securitize borders. So essentially, the story I told was one in which the humanitarian system has been increasingly perceived and used as a tool of extending imperialist power. Right? Now, with the rise of popular with authoritarians and the decline of liberalism, one might look at these troublemaking NGOs who still sometimes object, and sometimes object, and think, well, why the hell should I use you anyway? I'll just get my own tool. Why bother trying to use this tool if I can just get away with starting a tech-based aid organization with links to a private military organization? So that when the tool, the idea that you could just be this tool of empire and then you would be left alone, I think is proven rather false. And we also saw that in the response to USAID cuts, when immediately they started saying, we're soft power, we're just soft power, like, why are you doing this? But no one wants soft power anymore, they want hard power. So it was not it was a really ineffective line of argument. And it's one of the actual underlying critiques of the humanitarian mission's failure to push against power. So you have an erosion of principles, the weaponization of relief. So I've talked about Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, but also in South Sudan, a private company called Fogbo was hired by government forces to carry out airdrops in a particular territory, and that was directly perceived by people on the ground as a lure to bring them back into that area of government control. Normally, all that kind of activity would be done by neutral humanitarian actors. But now, why would they go with these troublesome people who sometimes give up when they can just get these private actors? So we see this question being asked, why don't these people who even raise small notes of objection? And then we saw this with the use and abuse of airdrops. In Gaza, also significantly weakened the credibility of the humanitarian response. So we can focus on the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, but really I think the use and abuse of humanitarian aid in Gaza goes beyond and goes before the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. So airdrops are a great example of the abuse of humanitarian relief or humanitarian camouflage. Airdrops appear to be a really reasonable thing to do. You're getting food really rapidly to people in a crisis context. Airdrops are only ever used in the humanitarian system with hard-to-reach populations, largely in places like sub-Saharan Africa, where you don't have roads and you have large populations spread out across small villages. They're never really ever used in dense urban centres because, firstly, they drop and kill people. Secondly, there are other so a lot of people talked about these critiques at the time, but one important critique to note is that the last time there was a really successful mass airdrop was at the end of the Second World War into the Netherlands, where the planes flew very low and they could just push the food off and it would land in quite spongy, sort of marshy earth. Someone died, a child died when that happened, not because it fell on him, but he ran up and grabbed a huge box of chocolate and started to eat it quickly because he was starving, and then he went into shock and died. So if you're in a situation of like starvation, you actually need specific forms of medical care to bring you out of starvation into health. So it actually requires a kind of medical assistance. So this could have also potentially triggered those problems. It also is there's also a spectacle in it. There's a lack of dignity involved and people running for the drops. And of course, it's not at all rationally distributed on the basis of need, but on the basis of the individual's ability to get there quicker than anyone else. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was a private initiative emerged in 2024. It's a US-based charity claiming to deliver aid directly to Gaza. It worked by circumventing institutions, positioning itself as an alternative to the UN system, and it was appealing to donor fatigue and distrust. And it also used spectacles, so it had very high profile sort of figures go and visit it and stand next to numbers of meals delivered, which if you knew anything at all about an aid operation, you would realize are the most insignificant numbers you've ever seen. But they look big to an uneducated public who doesn't, well, not uneducated, but unaware of humanitarian emergencies. So they look like big numbers, but actually all that is actually advertising a very inefficient aid system. And it doubled down on this presentation of neutrality when everyone could see that it was, of course, not neutral. And it also led to, according to an investigation by the New Humanitarian, it led to at least 3,000 people being killed seeking food from the Gaza humanitarian operation. The rule of thumb in the liberal humanitarian system is that aid is supposed to go to where people are. It is not supposed to be a sort of Hunger Games type scenario where everyone has to, if they're able-bodied, go and try and get the food. It's supposed to be delivered to distribution hubs so it can reach people. There are tried and tested methods. They've been established over many, many years. So the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation really was, I feel it's pointing us towards what might be the future of aid unless people get real about politics and fight back against the way in which the aid system has become a now unloved tool of imperialist control. But what about the alternatives? So there is a different sort of humanitarianism, which I call activist humanitarianism, others call vernacular humanitarianism, which frames the provision of assistance to people in need not as an act of charity, but as an act of solidarity. You don't run away from the fact that it's political. In fact, you embrace its political implications. And again, we saw that with Save the Children, right? They did not see their provision as a act or sort of neutral response to starving children in Germany in 1919. They saw it as a distinctly political act designed to break siege. So we also see an activist humanitarian tradition of attempting to break siege. Direct action used to confront blockades, restrictions from now the flotilla, which I'll talk about, to underground aid networks, getting food and support to people in conditions of limited mobility. We also see a history of individual humanitarians bravely becoming public witnesses to atrocity, refusing silence, speaking out in the face of impunity. For instance, with IDS, I wrote a piece with Martin Griffiths, who had that guy Tom Fletcher's job before Tom Fletcher, where Martin used the word genocide for the first time and spoke out about the second time he said it on the Sky News interview earlier, but he was now willing to speak out about what he saw in Gaza. And then we also see grassroots mobilization. So in many crises, the reality is, if a war descended on Brighton tomorrow, the first place we turn to support each other would probably be to our neighbours and friends in our building. And we'd probably start mobilizing locally. And that's what happens in every crisis. So in every crisis, the first time something bad happens, people start working together. There's a way in which we can say, let's find ways to support those initiatives rather than coming in with this big UN humanitarian system, but can we strengthen what humans do already? And this also has a radical lineage, connecting back to traditions of anti-colonial struggle, labour solidarity, and feminist organising. And it's also not, relatively recent as well. So there's been instances of very effective forms of activist humanitarian practice. So sometimes when I talk about this, so people can be like, oh, you're such a romantic, this can't possibly replace the UN humanitarian system. But in 2015, the most effective and first responses to the European refugee crisis on the Mediterranean were predominantly activist-run left-wing groups who were the first people to go out and start doing search and rescue. So this board here, the Louise Michel, it was paid for by Banksy, the artist. It was run by vegan feminists and anarchists. And it was a very fast response board that could outrun the Italian Coast Guard. And it was the first major board rescue mission that was going on in the Mediterranean. Eventually, the presence of these actors, this is I don't need to talk about, but this is their attempt to decide whether or not to intervene. This I can talk about. Eventually, the presence of these actors shamed Médecins Sans Frontières into also joining the response. So for the first time, MSF started to respond in the Mediterranean. And MSF at the time, they're a very transparent organization, so you can read accounts of the debates they had, and they were worried that it would look like they were intervening in a place that MSF shouldn't really be. They shouldn't really be in Europe, they should be elsewhere. And they talked about and thought through those risks, and they decided to then intervene. MSF didn't join the Sunni flotilla. They did have a discussion about it, but they ultimately decided they couldn't get good consensus, unfortunately. But one NGO did, Emergency, which is an Italian medical NGO. So where are we now with activist humanitarianism and particularly the Samud flotilla? So I see the Samud flotilla as true, genuine, and authentic humanitarian action, an attempt to break a siege and deliver food and medicine by sea. So remember when that mission was going, a lot of the criticism was this is a very insignificant amount of food, right? It's not the point. The point that the bit that's the humanitarian mission is the breaking the siege. This returned, the Samud flotilla can be connected back to say, Children, Oxfam, all these other organizations that have a history of breaking sieges. INGOs, I think, should have joined the flotilla. I think the MSF should have joined the flotilla. And I think them not joining shows us that unlike the refugee crisis in the Mediterranean, there's a bigger and more difficult political battle still to be won, Palestine. But I think that the issue of them not joining, which we'll talk about in a bit, shows that these organizations, especially not MSF because they're funded mostly by donations, but other organizations continue to conceptualize their public as donors rather than British people. So I have spoken on various forums about this stuff with various people at different levels of the system. And I said to them, tell me what would happen if the Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs decided every single day to drive a food trucks into Gaza, and he told the Security Council, I'm going to do it. I'd like you to offer my protection, but I'm going to do it anyway, and I'm going to keep doing it. Would then the next step be that Britain and the West say, that's it, we're blacklisting the Office for Coordinating Humanitarian Affairs? No way. They would never do that. So they think only about donors and not about how to build publics. The Samud flotilla built a public. Everyone was watching it. Thousands of people watching the footage, and they almost broke through. If there were more votes, more support, we even saw the way in which the Samud flotilla forced various nation states, while not a perfectly non-complicated story, nonetheless to offer some form of protection. Yes, it has problems, but nonetheless they were present. So we also saw how that actually forced that happen. So we saw the power of activism there. So that's my proposal for what aid should do next, is return to its activist origins, should we get much better at activism, should learn how to campaign to convince donors. I know you've had a talk about the accountability archive, so I was also going to quickly just say, rather than also just complain about all of this stuff and write this book, I'm also practically involved in a project that's attempting to collect and document every statement made by Western politicians that support the violation of international humanitarian law. And we're going to use that hopefully in secondary forms of legislation when court cases come in Britain, and they are going to come. There's no alternative path here. They either have to repeal the Genocide Act, or they have to face accountability in courts, and it will happen. So this is one other. If you're not aware of this project, please. If you see anything online, it sounds like they're justifying violating IHL or demonizing or defaming activists or attacking protesters, please use the accountability archive. So my conclusion, I think Gaza marks a reckoning, if not an end. The collapse of humanitarian aid and the total undeniability of its colonial logics opens a space to imagine a new ethics of solidarity and resistance. So I think we saw that in the Samud flotilla, and I shouldn't say new there, I should say renew or return to, because the key point is that this is actually part of the humanitarian tradition. And that in certain situations, at least, we need to move from concerns around access to demands for accountability and breaking the siege. We need to move beyond attempts to negotiate permission with perpetrators towards documenting, archiving, and exposing violations. And when action is completely blocked, we need to start thinking about whether we can take more radical actions to break into a particular territory. Obviously, there are high levels of risk, and people will risk their lives doing that, but that's a choice that has to be made freely by that individual. And this means getting politically smarter rather than passive. So now, I think that formal humanitarian organizations need to get better at activism, which is not the same as advocacy. Advocacy is trying to convince people of something. Activism is trying to change something, is how I see the difference. And they need to get better at building publics that support them, like the early humanitarians did. We need to move from a needs-based vision of humanitarian response to one embedded in rights and justice. So we need to anchor aid in political struggle and law and not silo politics, leaving the politics to others. So I was disappointed when I saw that MSF ran a campaign that said, doctors can't stop genocides, only states can, or something like this. When actually, of course, the truth is there are many humanitarians who've been meeting and discussing and trying to figure out what is it within the realm of their action that they can do to try to stop the genocide. And arguably, if the Samud flotilla had been hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of ships and had broken the siege, it would have at least had to cause some sort of pause or broken the situation in some way. So we need to move from global hierarchies to supporting local sovereignty. So we need to support grassroots infrastructure, grassroots responses in infrastructures of care, rather than subcontracting them as these kind of intermediaries. And we need to move from a language of neutrality to one of moral clarity, to reclaim humanitarian language as one of supporting and defending rights rather than addressing purely humanitarian need. So I don't think we should grieve the loss of the colonial humanitarian system, but fight for and celebrate a new politics of care that can be rooted in solidarity, truth-telling, and a refusal of complicity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Philip, for this wonderful presentation. I'm sure there are a lot of questions. So shall we manage the one online, or should we get some questions from the room and some questions online? Yeah?
Yeah.
All good? A lot of talking, plus 3 hours lecture.
Okay, our lecture was, sorry if I seem out of it.
You've done very well. Please.
I do have a comment, but first of all, could you give us the name of the book you talked about?
It's going to be called, probably going to be called the end. Which my book?
No, you mentioned the way Richard written this.
Oh, it's called Complicit.
It's just called Complicit.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, by Peter Orwell.
But my comment is you talked about the most natural thing in the world is for neighbours to help each other, and I certainly agree with that. It happens all the time, and it's a very effective way of helping. But there is a limit to that, as we saw in Greece, as we saw in Italy. You run out of funding, you run out of space, you run out of tents and all that.
Yeah.
So you therefore have to ask for help. And the people who've got the money are the agencies.
Yeah, yeah.
Or governments.
So in the work I did in Greece, and the paper I wrote about it actually explores exactly that dilemma, because we compare actually in that work two forms of grassroots response. One that was more NGOized and had access to donor funds, and one that was the anarchist response. And both ultimately ended up producing similar tensions. So the anarchist movement did run out of funding, and then that produced a real sense sort of tension around the little bit of money we have, who has control of it, where is it? And then you ended up having splintering, they splintered like 5 or 6 times, and then everything kind of fell apart. But nonetheless, in those initial moments, it was a very effective response, because I should give more context. The projects were responding to displaced LGBT refugees from predominantly from the Middle East in Greece. So the response in Greece showed that the thing that everyone wants is housing. Donors are unwilling to fund housing. So but for these grassroots groups, they don't care. They just occupied a building and made housing, right? In Lebanon, the organization that was responding was forbidden by its donor to permit housing. So it also then produced a huge amount of frustration and anger from its recipients, because the one thing they wanted, they were not allowed to have. So it's a very difficult situation with no answer, because the issue is not just not having funds, it's when those funds come and there's some sort of conditionality you can't get out of attached to them. And then they sap away that problem. There are successful examples of sort of cooperatives and that go on and raise funds and raise money, and there are ways to do things without money. And my proposal really is that it's a technical question of how should we deal with the existence of these grassroots organizations. So the first problem for a humanitarian organization is they can't fund them. because they're not an entity, it's a neighborhood. So how do you fund this entity? They can't pass a due diligence form. So you can actually getting the money is really difficult. So I think that if we experimented with being able to give people money without all of the various contracting requirements that prevented you giving them that assistance, and then stood back from that and watched whether or not they produce effective responses to crises, potentially more effective than having a P5 UN international staff paid hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe then we could then judge it. But the problem is getting, not that they shouldn't have money, it's that the conditionality then takes away its radical potential and power.
Mimi, and then Simon, and then I go online for another couple of questions that are very interesting.
Okay, perhaps just to pick up on this and then add something on a bit different. It seems like the splintering of the liberal humanitarian order, you've got a picture of, you've got a securitized humanitarianism and then grassroots humanitarianism, which is really from the bottom up, people there and so on. But I wonder actually if there's a role for the state in that more kind of vernacular humanitarianism. And what I have in mind here, and you're probably going to hate me for saying this, is the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, which is an East African intergovernmental authority, which, you know, for all of its complexities and tensions, has pioneered a deeply humanistic understanding of refugee policy. But millions upon millions upon millions of people live as refugees in East Africa. In Uganda, the Ugandan, through IGAD, they said, brothers and sisters from Sudan, come, this is your land. We give you land. You don't need paper or documentation to work. You are part of us. Something similar happens in Ethiopia, something similar in Somalia, less similar in Kenya because that's too much of the US influence. But the point is like, if you speak to people in IGAD, they have this incredible understanding that there is no crisis in East Africa. These are just human beings, fellow sisters and brothers. And so there is this opportunity for this kind of grassroots-led people's movement and then states working with each other, holding each other accountable, I think. So that's the one thought I wanted to put on the table, just as part of that model.
No, I'm not against the idea of finding ways to fund, support, and build the capacity of a more grassroots humanitarian response. I think the issue is that those cases are relatively rarer, where you see that they haven't been co-opted to the point that they no longer become useful.
Yeah.
So there's a really great interview with one of the founders of the emergency rooms, where in the beginning he speaks like a radical, and they interview him again and he sounds like a UN bureaucrat. Right, so they come in and then you have to start learning to speak this language, and then you can't get out of this language, and then you end up ultimately kind of feeding and serving the machine. But a better vision and commissioning strategy would be one in which grassroots responses just get unconditional cash, and then you can, yes, monitor whether or not it's effective. You can do some due diligence, but it probably would be more effective. But all of this then has to deal with the fact that we're assuming that it's actually in the interests of anyone to have a truly effective aid system. Is it not shaped in its current form precisely because it's effective at the thing that they want it to do, which is to prevent people moving out of crisis and remaining in a permanent public crisis until they get rid of the government that we don't like?
I'll leave it there. I feel like I want to have this more of a conversation. But there's a second thought, just briefly, which is this distinction between illiberal and liberal humanitarianism. I wanted to suggest maybe that, you know, I would see it as a relationship between liberal and fascist humanitarianism. I think that the language of fascism is much more accurate, it's clear and pointed. And essentially, I think there's been these arguments about how liberalism contains within it fascism, right? So there's a very deep interrelationship between liberalism and fascism. And one example I could give you is the way in which these airdrops, for example, in South Sudan and Sudan, I was working in a context where there were mercenaries who were doing the airdrops on behalf of FAO and the World Food Programme, and they were very clearly also dropping off huge amounts of weapons.
Yeah.
You know, and so like that was part of the liberal humanitarian order, but it was extremely violent.
Yeah. There's a long history of that.
Yeah.
Brigands with Asians.
Yeah, no, but do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's like, it's not a, they're contained within each other.
Those words as kind of an imminent critique. It's not an endorsement of the words,
Yeah.
but like when we want to identify this thing that is a combination of the UN, Security Council, NGOs, coordination committees, clusters, whatever. We need a word to call it, or what is upholding and representing, and it's representing this idea of liberal humanitarianism, which itself is also, I agree entirely, always already contained within it fascism and imperialism, etc., etc. Illiberalism is not like what illiberalism means in the sense that we use it for this other work we're doing is that it's basically saying that all of that stuff we pretended to believe, we don't even believe in it anymore. Instead, we're going to actively go against it. So it's kind of like Trump attacking the courts, right? We don't think the courts are particularly wonderful institutions and also have all these problems. But then you have a liberalism coming and saying, well, why do we need the court? Why do we need the UN? Attacking the UN, it's kind of pushing against the thing. So the illiberalism might not properly exist, but illiberalism is definitely then fighting a phantom, if you see. It's a response to this phantom.
Hi, thanks for a great presentation. At the beginning, you distinguish between the state or state institutions like FCDO or USA and the public. You're saying that the public should play a more prominent role, but ideally in a democracy, the state is the public.
Yeah.
So what I hear you're saying is this one way of thinking about this is a failure of Western democracy in that it's just not working in a way that you and I would like. And if it was, then let's say the Samud flotilla people got elected prime minister or presidents of their countries, then what would the aid system and the money, that's where the money is. The question is, how is it deployed?
Yeah.
And then just one other observation, you criticize the neoliberals for not being independent.
Yeah.
But if you're going to frame this whole conversation along political lines, then you're not independent either.
No, I'm
not saying you shouldn't, but I mean, it's, this isn't about independence, it's about politics.
Yeah. So the first point on the donors and politics, that's exactly correct. FCDO is upholding policy that should be the policy that the British electorate supported when they voted for this particular political party into power. Humanitarians don't think that way.
Yeah.
When they talk about donors, they're talking often about when I hear it mentioned, it's like this abstract entity where they'll say the donors would never allow it. Okay, right, but the donors have publics. The donor is a government. So my argument on this part of the book is that if Oxfam, for instance, who get they get government funds, right? They get some government funds. If they joined the flotilla and said, we were founded to prevent famine, and now a famine has been declared, so of course we're joining. Then is Keir Starmer going to turn around and say Oxfam is a blacklisted organisation? No, never. Their upcry and the horror would be such that it would severely limit his capacity to move. And he would not be able to do that. It's a level up. I mean, maybe he tried, right? But it is a level up from Palestine Action. It's going from people who are carrying out direct action, which, that can be a hard sell among, usually Brits, right? But Oxfam is a much, and preventing famine is going to be a hard sell if they say, we're taking all this food now to join this mission to support and prevent famine. So that my call there is to think politically, that humanitarian organizations have to think like activists, and they used to have. There's also a staffing issue. Humanitarian organizations used to have lots of activists within them. It used to be a very activist type organizations. This is where you'd go if you were, a student at Sussex, and you go and you're political here, and then you go and join these organizations. Now it's full of like accountants and information management and business case officers and people who don't know how to campaign. So they've lost that ability to think politically. And then to the point that I say these things to people and they're like, oh my God, we could never do that. Well, why? You have to think politically about things. What are the next step? And my problem is pretending you're not political. My problem is presenting things that are like, there probably are some cases in which when people start SMEs and there's a genuine market analysis being done, that they probably would actually be able to get some money that would sustain them. But you can't say that that vision of what should happen in a crisis, which is basically a kind of self-sufficient micro loan, pay back your loan, run a small business, that this is free from any sort of vision of economy. It's not. It's not a neutral claim, right? So pretending it's not is what I object to. You know, because if I say I think we should have mutual aid, I know I'm speaking from a left tradition, and I'm fine with saying that. But I don't like presenting things that are actually political as if they're common sense when actually they're not common sense. And it makes it harder to deal with and argue, because then you have to go through the whole process of explaining everything about, you know, you can't really engage until you've said this is actually political for this, and this reason. Whereas if I say I support mutual aid, anyone can say, well, here are all the problems with mutual aid, 1, 2, 3.
Great. We actually, thank you so much, and I know there is another question. I'm just gonna go online for a second, then we'll pick it up. We have actually a couple of questions on Palestine action.
Okay.
That have to do with I'm gonna read one, I'm just gonna capture also the other one. Well, do you want to ask the question because you captured it?
Sure. So do you believe that the crackdown on humanitarian activism, such as the prescribing of Palestinian action, is a systematic oppression?
So actually, how do you see Palestine action in the context of humanitarianism? That's possibly the first question, right?
Okay.
I mean, is it even or is it just an activist? And I think it connects to your activist humanitarianism concept.
Yeah. So
Which I have quite a few questions about as well, so I think it's interesting.
So the Palestine action situation I see is relating to international humanitarian law rather than humanitarian practice. So my theory as to why Palestine action were prescribed is that had they stood trial in a criminal court, they would likely be found by a British judge as having upheld what's called the responsibility to protect doctrine, which requires that states ideally act to prevent and stop genocide. But there have been successful cases historically where people have used that defense when carrying out perceived to be illegal actions against military facilities. Had that case then gone to pass, then that would have unleashed the stack of cases against Keir Starmer, David Lammy, David Cameron, Rishi Sunak that are waiting to go. Because then you have a British court saying they were acting to prevent genocide, which then creates the implication of these individuals were acting to generate, push,
Or they were
or
not.
not acting to stop at least, or at least broken the Genocide Act. So that's why they prescribed it, because it prevents criminal court, which prevents then a defense of international humanitarian law.
Okay. And then the second group of questions that I have toward you are about the very interesting concept you're putting forward of activist humanitarianism.
Yeah.
And the limits of
Yeah.
this concept. So one of the limits is, do they have enough funds?
Yeah.
Where do they get their resources?
Yeah.
And what's their effectiveness compared to a more organized?
Yeah.
And in my my mind, the organizational scholar is almost thinking about a movement versus an hierarchical organization,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So what's the
So are they effective? Often,
because you spoke about them as symbolic.
yeah. So they have lots of effects, right? So one of their effects is that the Samud flotilla, to a certain degree, forced some nation states to offer what could be perceived as protection. It was not going to protect them all the way up to Gaza, but that was really the first time we saw any kind of hint of protecting a humanitarian mission. And they managed to provoke that. So as activists, they're effective. And I mean, all the entire history of humanitarian organization, when Jeb and Buxton founded Save the Children, they held a public meeting at the Albert Hall where they came and talked about what they were doing, and they were pelted with rotten fruit because the idea of assisting these foreign children was so appalling. Then over time, they successfully generated a new ethic of care for those who may be even on a different side to us. So they are effective at changing attitudes. Now, are they effective operationally? The first thing to say is that they're not they haven't been substantially monitored, like as you would do monitoring and evaluation of a humanitarian operation. But what we can say is definitely they're effective in that they are cheap, embedded, they have an understanding of people's needs. Often, actually, you know, as I said before, there's this idea of baseline communism or emergency communism, that in a crisis when we would actually revert to from each according to ability to each according to his need. So, you know, for instance, in Lebanon during the various wars, houses, like lots of apartments report that they started, you know, functioning as these sort of units where they were doing collective cooking, and if someone had some solar, they were sharing that solar out, and then people being able to access electricity. So often it is actually just the thing that responds. I think the more interesting question is often, is the humanitarian system itself effective? And also as an organizational scholar, you know, you would have a nightmare. The idea that people have in the UN that you can pull a lever and then something's going to happen. Nothing ever happens. People are just pulling this lever all the time and nothing ever happens. You know, it just does, the hierarchy doesn't work, and then they go around pretending they can still pull this lever.
And the funds don't work.
And the funds don't go to where they say they will, and I think it at least warrants an exploration as to what's more effective.
Wonderful, thank you so much. I also have some people that have brought up good examples of, you know, like the Red Crescent has been doing a fantastic job. They still operate according to some of those principles. So, you know, there are, not all organizations are, you know, illiberal, right?
No,
So
no.
this is the new rise of a new kind of, well, or a more explicit delineation
Correct.
of an organization that already existed, but there are some organizations that are doing a good job.
Of course, no, of course, there are many organizations in Gaza that have been doing essential and important work. The question is not whether or not that work is good or not. It's whether or not that work or the position of humanitarians can move beyond existing in highly contained, constrained, difficult circumstances where you're not even able to truly scratch the surface of humanitarian need, you know. Whether or not actually time and resources might be better spent doing more bold, drastic activist action, which is never to say that people are not incredibly brave in MSF and MAP and other organizations in Palestine working. There are, of course, many bad examples of humanitarian aid as well, but there are many good examples. But the question is, what's going to emerge from this moment in which its credibility has collapsed?
And how should we stop taking for granted? Right? Should be very flexible. Great. Would you like to ask your question?
Thanks so much, Philip. You know, that was really compelling, and I'm excited for the book, but there was one bit at the end that I was a bit surprised about, where you say that for this new or renewed humanitarianism, it shouldn't be needs-based as much as it should be rooted in the law, rights, and justice. And that's a bit confusing because the international legal system and international legal infrastructure is plagued by the very same colonial, capitalist, imperialist logics that are symptomatic of the humanitarian system. I mean, we had Dick Cheney, Dyer Freeman. This week we've had war criminals all over the world. So it feels like there's a bit of misplaced faith in both international and domestic law and the ability of the law and rights frameworks to curb anything other than elite interest.
Well, I'm an academic and I'm an activist, so sometimes I do boosterism. So I also understand that there will be a struggle to get people in front of the courts. But I also, you know, will never say it's impossible, because I think this is what we should actually be aiming for, and it's effective. I also don't think that international humanitarian law within it, or within international law within it, there are necessarily problematic kind of colonialist implications. I mean, a lot of the law is basically like, you know, you have to permit a UN humanitarian mission to move in a particular space, right? The problem is just the enforcement of that law. And that's why I don't have faith necessarily in the ICJ. And I see the way in which the ICJ is like somehow in popular imagination become seen as the kind of genocide auditing body. Like, we have to wait for the ICJ to say genocide. No, I mean, that's not their role, right? It's also the Independent Commission of Inquiry said genocide. So it's not their role. So it actually can be used as this kind of pushing back pushing back politics, and it can be ineffective. But I do have faith in domestic law, because domestic law has a mechanism for enforcement, and as as a Brit, if they then try to get out of the legal case by removing the Genocide Act, I can campaign and fight, trying to stop that. We have a mass movement to try and stop it. It would be an insane thing to do. But domestic courts have enforcement mechanisms, and that we can push for it, and this should be the objective, because this is the only way in which these people will see any sort of accountability within a liberal system.
We are past the time. People online are fading away, which means the people in the room are fading away in different ways, right? But I have one last question, which is also an interesting provocation that I just received online, and then after this, I think we can thank you. I take you to the yes. And the question is, should we be arguing that solidarity should be integrated as a formal humanitarian principle?
Yes. Yeah, that's how the book ends.
Alexander Batsky online, well done. Yes,
Yeah.
right, wonderful. Yeah, so spoiler alert, basically.
Yeah, I say get rid of neutrality, put in solidarity.
Okay, wonderful. This is really, it's really a fantastic talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Yeah, very good.
No, come on.
This is really.
Oh, thank you very much.